Så idag ska vi få lyssna till Barry O'Reilly som har sin tes kring Antifragile och den kursen som också heter Antifragile som vi har. Designing the Systems of the Future är vignetten till det här seminariet som kommer hålla på i ungefär 1 timme. Därefter finns det också en generös halvtimme för att ställa frågor. Så ni som har frågor, skriv ner dem i chatten så att vi kan gemensamt få svar på dem efter seminariet. Och därmed så, ja vad ska vi säga mer egentligen? Vi hälsar med Barry välkommen. Det är ganska tomt här i våra lokaler. Vi är på Fleming 7 som är dataföreningen Kompetens kursgård eller kurslokaler helt enkelt. Och de är då utrustade i det här hybridformatet. Där vart den stora grejen är att alla ser alla. Så även fast vi genomför kurser i hybridformatet så är det väldigt viktigt att alla kan ta del av kursen som om man vore här. Att man får interaktionen mellan lärare och deltagare. Men nu hälsar jag Barry välkommen så kör han igång här. Ha det gott!
Okay, so let's get started. So we have 90 minutes in front of us, and there'll be some time at the end for questions. As Matt said, he'll probably speak for a little bit more than 1 hour. But feel free to add questions in the chat as we go. I'll take them at the end of the session. This session is done, and the entire course is done in English, and that's because the academic research and everything that backs this up is done in English, and it's quite difficult to translate it to Swedish. Plus we tend to get some people, because of my name and background, people turning up in these seminars and courses who don't speak English, and the courses tend to have quite an international audience as well. But do feel free to write or ask questions in Swedish, it's not a problem. So the topic of today's seminar is Antifragile, Designing the Systems of the Future. So just a little bit about me to start off with. I'm the founder of a company called Black Tulip Technology, which is based out here in Stockholm's skärgård, out in the archipelago. And it's a company that does teaching, research, and occasionally, if the project's interesting enough, consultancy. And the goal of this company is to redefine what we call software or IT architecture as a marriage between two very, very different concepts, complexity science and systems engineering, two things that essentially don't work very well together. One is a science of uncertainty and one is a science of certainty. I'm a PhD candidate within complexity science and software engineering. So all of the things that you'll see today aren't just my random thoughts on the matter. This is real peer-reviewed science that we're going to look at today. And we'll also talk about why it's important that it has to be that way in order for these ideas to be credible. I've been a startup CTO, a chief architect at a little company called IDesign in Silicon Valley, and also at a large company called Microsoft across Western Europe once upon a time. I've been a global lead for solutions architecture at Microsoft for a period of years, and been on the cutting edge of cloud and IoT during the time, during 6 years at Microsoft. So what we're going to see here today is the product of a long career as a software architect, working with some fairly cutting edge stuff. And one of the tasks I was given in my time at Microsoft was to prepare the ground for cloud, to start educating more and more architects so that we had the right kind of architectural strength when we went out to our customers, which led to me spending a great deal of time thinking about what is an architect, how do we create architects, and how do we create architects who thrive in the kind of modern projects that they're expected to deliver in? What are the problems that they're experiencing, and how can we make this easier? So a lot of what you're going to see today is based on answering those questions. So this session, the stuff that we're going to look at today, I think is really, really important for anyone, whether you're an architect or a senior developer or you work in infrastructure, anyone who's making decisions about the structure of software in modern enterprises. Obviously 90 minutes isn't a great deal of time, so this is just a taster. It's just a basic introduction to the ideas. The scope of what we're going to look at is absolutely enormous. And a lot of the things I'm going to say and a lot of the statements I'm going to make are potentially very, very shocking. A lot of what we're going to look at here today is going to push back maybe on some of the methodologies that you've used before. It's going to lift up some stones that maybe we don't want to look under. And we're going to ask ourselves, the way that we practice architecture today, is it really working? Is it really efficient? And we might also dive into some technology that's a little bit deeper than what some of us are used to as architects. So I apologize in advance for if I offend anyone. If you believe very deeply in anything like Agile or TOGAF or SAFe, then some of the statements I make might be considered shocking, but it's all said with love. And it's all about dealing with uncertainty. So what we're actually doing here, and given the fact that these ideas were brought forward in order to be able to create architects who were able to cope with modern enterprise environments and all the uncertainty that entails, this report from the World Economic Forum, the Future of Jobs report, talked about the kind of skills that we were going to need to see in our workforce in 2022. And the kind of things that we see that we're going to need are things like analytical thinking, technology design, complex problem solving, and opposed to, and on the blue side of things here, on the left-hand side of the diagram, we see the kind of things that employers want their people to be able to do. And this is also true of architects. If you look at the declining skills, the things that aren't really going to be in demand in 2022, things like technology installation and maintenance, the management of material resources, technology use monitoring and control. This is something that, as architects working in modern enterprise environments, that we need to get a grip on, and it's not something that we're particularly good at. Talking in general in the software industry, when we talk about something being complex, what we tend to mean is very, very complicated. And there's no real distinction between these two things. We see complex as an extension of complicated. Those of us who do talk about complexity in more definite terms tend to talk about things like algorithmic complexity, which is a very different thing than the kind of complexity we experience in our organizations. And so we have this framework which gives us a head start, gives us a very easy way to start this conversation about what do we actually mean when we say that something is complex. And this, what we've got in front of us here on the screen, is something called Cynefin, which is written like this, Cynefin, which is a Welsh word, so it's not pronounced anyway in any way how it sounds. And this is a framework that helps us to establish where are we, what kind of problem are we working with? Are we actually dealing with complexity, or is it something else? And the Cynefin divides the world into 5 different domains. And generally we can say that a problem that we're trying to solve exists in one of these domains. The first domain is the obvious domain. And the obvious domain, you know you're in the obvious domain whenever you're working with a problem which everyone understands. And an example of an obvious problem is if I give you the keys to my car and ask you to park it for me, you know what I mean, you know what I want, you know what the key is for, you understand what it is that I mean. It's fairly tightly constrained. I'm not saying take my car and drive it to Sundsvall. I'm saying take my car and park it for me. And you don't really need to do a lot of preparation. You don't need to ask a lot of questions. You just need to listen to me, understand that I need to park the car and go and do it. And obvious problems tend to have best practices. They're well established. Everyone knows how to do it. You know how to park a car. Don't crash into anything. Use the mirrors, that kind of thing. And the way we respond to obvious problems is we sense, we figure out what the problem is, we categorize and we say this is a car parking problem, and then we respond. Very, very simple. A complicated problem then is also something that's readily understood. We know what it is. We know what it is we're trying to solve. We know what the problem is, but there are many, many options. There are many different ways that we can solve this particular problem. And therefore we need to sense, figure out what is this problem, what is it that we're trying to achieve. We realize that there's many different ways we could solve this, so we need to do some kind of analysis. And analysis usually means that we need some kind of expert to look at this problem, figure out what is the best out of these possible responses, and then we respond. Complicated problems tend to have good practice in that there's many, many different ways to solve the problem. There's going to be opinions about how we solve the problem. It requires analysis. There can't be a best practice that says you absolutely have to do this. You're going to have to think for yourself a little bit when you're dealing with a complicated problem. An example of a complicated problem is that instead of asking you to park my car, I say my car's making a funny noise when I drive it. What could that be? Okay, and at that point, most of us can't answer that question. We can all understand what the problem is, but you need some form of expertise in order to perform an analysis, and that's usually a car mechanic who understands what to look for, how to diagnose that kind of problem. Okay, that's a complicated problem. And at that stage, we usually divide the world in half along this line down the middle, and we say that the problems over here are ordered. There is order to these problems. We understand that, and when I say ordered, I mean that we understand the relationship between cause and effect. We understand that if I put the key in the car and put it in reverse, the car will go backwards. I understand that if I'm an expert, I understand that if there's a noise coming from the car, then one of the causes of that noise could be a stone in the hubcap, for example. These are ordered, and ordered means that the relationship between cause and effect is well understood. On this side then, we have the disordered problems. And the first domain here is complex, and complex problems are not simply very, very complicated problems. They're a completely different kind of thing. In a complex environment, the relationship between cause and effect is very, very shaky. In order to solve a complex problem, we need to probe, and that means we need to test, we need to run some experiments, we need to figure out what's actually happening in this environment. After we've probed the environment, find out a little bit more, then we can start to make sense of it, and then we can respond. And in that kind of environment, which is like, say, driving a car on a highway, which is, it's never the same twice. You're not entirely sure about the relationship between cause and effect because there's lots and lots of independent drivers moving around you. And the way that we deal with this is through emergent practice. So there's no best practice for driving on a crowded highway. You have to fit in with the traffic, you have to fit in with the flow, you have to respond to events as they happen. And on the other side of that, we have something called chaotic, and chaotic is when there is absolutely no relationship between cause and effect, and you don't have time to probe and figure out what those things are. All you can do in a chaotic environment is simply act, and then figure out what happened when you act, and then respond to that in some way. The example for a chaotic situation usually is a tiger runs into the room, starts attacking people. What do? you don't actually know what you'll do until it happens. And you won't actually know if what you do is going to work until you do it in that environment and figure out what to happen. So this framework tends to describe our journey through particular things. For example, if you think about 100 years ago, whenever cars were first introduced, it was an entirely new idea. We definitely didn't have any concept of best practices. We weren't really sure what these things were. There was no such thing as a driving license or anything like that. So cars are first introduced. And the first two people who owned cars, when they met each other on the road for the first time, would have experienced a chaotic situation. They wouldn't have known exactly what to do. What do we do in this situation? You've got two cars moving at what for the time would have been very, very high speeds towards each other. What do you do in that situation? Do you brake? Do you swerve into the ditch? Do you keep going and expect the other car coming towards you to yield or to pull over? What do you do? And so in that situation, there's no guidelines, there's no constraints, there's no one telling you what to do. You've never experienced this before. You just have to do something. Slam on the brakes, swerve to the side, do something. And if that doesn't work, if you swerve to the side and the other car coming towards you swerves to the same side, then you've got to respond to that very, very quickly. And so you're building up a novel practice, a new set of ideas about how do I react to this situation. What happens then over a period of time, if we discover that we experience this confusion, this chaos constantly, and whenever two cars meet on the road, we introduce constraint. And chaotic systems have absolutely no constraint. It's one of the things that makes them chaotic. We can do anything we want. And so the first thing that we do in our car, in this situation with the car, is that we introduce the concept of driving on a particular side of the road. And we introduce white lines, which we put in the middle of the road. And we say, everyone keep to the left or to the right of this white line. And that chaos goes away because of this constraint. Well, it mostly goes away. And that means that we all know what to do, and there's less chaos in the system. Then over time, we realize that there are other situations that we find particularly difficult, where chaos becomes apparent. One of those things is when we come to a junction. What are the rules when we have a junction like this? And so we add more constraints, things like stop signs, yield signs, traffic lights, and we start to add more and more constraint to the system. And as we add more constraints, people experience less chaos in the system. And the system itself that we're building with white lines and traffic lights and all of these things starts to become a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder to learn, but it reduces chaos in the overall system. And now, instead of just having to act, instead of just having to throw ourselves into it, test things and see what happens, and we can move to the complex domain, and we can probe. We come to a junction, we look around, we test our way forward. And as the traffic system matured over the last 100 years, the rules and the ideas became, we added more and more and more constraints. We added speed limits. We added more and more complicated traffic signs. Things like höga regler, which nobody really understands, are added to the mix, and so the system becomes complicated. And once the system becomes complicated, then it just requires expertise and the ability to analyze it. And then eventually, when enough people have expertise in this, enough people know how to drive, and it becomes easy to communicate, it becomes obvious. And once something becomes obvious, then we can make it more and more tightly constrained. And we can say, well, we have this concept of a driving license. Everyone has to go and take lessons. Everyone has to prove that they're able to drive. Everyone has to go and do a theory test where they prove that they understand all of these rules. And eventually we end up with best practices for driving. So don't break the speed limit, stop at a stop sign, don't start driving on an orange light, wait until it's green, things like that. And so something that's new, something that we don't understand, tends to be chaotic. And in order to move away from that chaos, we add constraint. And once we start adding constraint, we move from that chaotic place all the way to obvious. In the theory of Cynefin, that's how the world works. And this is very, very good for us as architects to understand, because it helps us to understand what is it, what kind of problem am I dealing with, what kind of problem is this? And the truth is that for the vast majority of projects that we work in tend to be complicated. And the complicated domain is where we as architects and software engineers are most comfortable. And this is where you need to be an expert. And our expertise is what we earn our money on, our expertise within technology. And so the way that we solve most of our problems is to sense, analyze using our expertise, and respond. And we're all guided by good practices, things like solid and patterns from object orientation and all of these things. The complicated world is where we as architects feel most comfortable. As technical experts, the complicated world is where we want to be. And if you're a software vendor, the complicated world is fantastic, because you can sell products to the mass market that require expertise for you to be able to build. Modern organizations, however, are entirely complex, and they're complex because they're human systems. And human systems, you can say that we never really understand the links between cause and effect. Things are always different, things are constantly changing, and they're very, very dynamic. And over the course of the last 30 years, human systems have become even more dynamic and even more complex, and that's because of the internet and because of this mass level of interaction and interdependency that we have now in our society. We're more interconnected than we've ever been, and this means that that changes tend to ripple very, very quickly through our society. And organizations at the same time are becoming ever more complex. Supply chains are becoming ever more complex, and the world as experienced by most people in business is incredibly complex. And that means that a lot of the problems we're trying to solve as architects are also complex. And so I usually do an experiment when I'm teaching architects, and I ask them to write down the 3 biggest failures that they've ever experienced in their careers as architects. And once they've written down those 3 biggest failures, I ask them to say, which one of these domains did the problem that you were trying to solve belong in? And then I asked them to write down, which one of these domains did your approach belong in? And then I asked them to look for a pattern. And that pattern is always the same. For the vast majority of field software projects, we have a problem in one of these domains, usually complex, and we have an approach in another one of the domains, usually complicated or sometimes obvious. And this inability to understand or grasp complexity is the thing that lies behind most of the failures that we see in software architecture. And that's a pattern that's repeated itself over and over again over the course of asking this question of thousands of architects across the world. So our inability to understand when we're working with complex problems, when we're working with complicated problems, this is what's causing us issues in architecture. And as the world becomes more and more complex, we see that this happens more and more often. The 5th domain of Cynefin is here in the middle, and it's called the confused domain. And you're in the confused domain when you haven't actually figured out or don't have the capacity to figure out which domain you're actually in. And so software architecture for a very, very long time has been in the confused domain. And since our default is complicated, that means that we're very, very good at solving complicated problems. So tightly coupled systems which have governing constraints and require good practices and expertise, that's where we're happy, that's where we succeed. Complex problems which are more loose, where cause and effect is less apparent, that's where we tend to fall apart, because we import our complicated methods like SAFe and TOGAF into the complex domain, and that's why we fail. So, okay, Let's just try and get rid of that those drawings from the last slide. So what's happening then is that the systems that we work with as architects are becoming more and more complex. And there is, as we said, a general increase in complexity in our day-to-day lives. That part of that, a lot of that is to do with the internet and the interconnectivity of the world, and the fact that our economies and our political systems are becoming more and more interconnected to each other globally, and the rise of globalization has made things more complex. We're also now building systems of systems, and anyone who's worked with a smart city project where you see potentially millions of devices connecting up to many, many different servers and influencing each other with feedback loops that we don't really understand. We'll see that these systems are becoming more and more complex, more and more dynamic. The scale of what we're building is becoming enormous as well. It's quite common now for an application built in a garage in San Francisco to have several million users in the first few months of its life. The systems that we're building are becoming revenue critical. We're moving away from the age where software systems were built as a support to business by making it easier for the business to execute on their processes and keep records of that, to a situation where technology actually is part of the business, and it has to evolve and it has to respond at the same speed that business people are used to responding and make decisions when they're making business decisions and building businesses. And that's quite difficult for us. We're doing all of this. We're building critical infrastructure. So the stuff that we're building now is important to our society. If Amazon stopped working right now in the middle of this pandemic, we'd figure out how critical software is to us right now. And we're doing this on top of cloud, which is inherently fragile and which brings a great deal of technology churn. And so as we move into the future, our technology and the technology that we're expected to deliver is being delivered into more and more complex environments. And what's happening is this is provoking the need for our software to evolve. And so software, for the 60 or 70 years of its existence, software has been on a continuous path of evolution. And we started off with procedural code, and then sometime in the 1960s, around the time of the NATO conference in Nuremberg, around 1968, we started to move towards modular code because we realized that this is difficult. Writing software is incredibly difficult. And so people like Dijkstra and Hoare started to talk about the need to build software with modules in order to make it more adaptable, in order to allow it to cope with the increasingly complex things it was being asked to do. This was back in the late 1960s. Then we started to move towards something called object orientation, and we spent quite a few years trying to figure that one out. Eventually we moved on to component orientation, and then after many, many years, we discovered some useful ideas, and we call that service orientation. Service orientation was a set of ideas that allowed Amazon, a bookseller, to become the purveyors of the most powerful computing platform we've ever seen on this planet. So service orientation was directly related to the emergence of cloud. And when we get to cloud, then patterns like microservices that once upon a time seemed quite fanciful and very, very difficult to do, and things like event sourcing, which 10 or so years ago was considered to be Star Trek technology, now become very, very possible. And so we're moving to an era where systems are going to become something I've called complex responsive, where the software that we're building is going to need to respond to the complex environments that we're actually doing business in. And as these dynamic, complex systems shift and turn, and as the relationship between cause and effect changes, or we become more aware of it, our software is going to have to respond to that. And we're already seeing the impacts of this today. Software is expected to do a lot more than it was expected to do 20 years ago. As that software evolves, us as architects are going to be responsible for the quality of that software. And quality in these contexts is going to be the perception of how well we're able to meet that complexity. And if we look at this bell curve represents everything that can go wrong in a system that we're delivering. And all of these things in the middle of the bell curve are the things that we should be able to predict are going to go wrong with the system. These are the things that go wrong most often, okay, in the middle of the bell curve. So things like disk failures, network failures, bugs in the software, changes in requirements, all of these things happen here in the middle of the bell curve. And theoretically, we have a solution to managing these kind of failures in our systems, and that solution is something called systems engineering. And systems engineering is a discipline which I believe and which I've seen is sorely lacking across huge swathes of the technology industry today. The ability to do systems engineering is disappearing for some reason. And so we get surprised by these very, very normal failures when a server goes down, or when a network goes down, or when there's a sudden influx of users or an attack on the system, then our systems fall down, and that's not good. And so the way to solve that problem is to enhance our systems engineering capacity. And systems engineering is not that difficult to learn. Unfortunately, there's not as much emphasis on it if you study computer science at university these days, but it is a very, very useful tool. And so one of the things we can do, one of the things we must do as an industry in order to deliver better software is to have a solid concept of systems engineering. Unfortunately, it's not enough in these complex environments, because out here in what we call the tail of a probability distribution, there are lots and lots of other things that can happen which have much lower probability. And if you use systems engineering and you use standard techniques like enterprise risk management, things that have low probability tend to get taken away, or we tend to ignore them because we haven't got time to do everything. And so we call these things out in the tail, we call them black swans. And they've got very low probability, they don't happen very often, but they do have a tendency to completely define the future of the system. And the bad news is that because we're working in complex systems rather than complicated systems, we don't work with normal distributions anymore. Normal distributions don't apply. And that means that all of the ordinary things like disk failures and network failures and all of the things we can expect to happen in our systems that we can solve with systems engineering are up here. But the distributions obey a power law, which means that we have much more space. The tail is much bigger. There's much more that can happen. And it's in this tail that we have black swans. And mathematically, if you take the area under the curve in any point in a probability distribution, that gives you the probability that something in here is going to happen. In these fat tail systems, the tail is so long that the area under the curve approaches the entire area of the system, which means that the probability of something happening in here approaches 1. Which means that if you're only working in this part, if you're only working with systems engineering and the predictable things that are going to go wrong in your system, then you're building a system that has a probability of failure of 1. We are building systems that are mathematically guaranteed to fail. And that's really depressing. So the thing that we need to get used to as well, and like I said, when we talk about complexity as software engineers and architects, we tend to fall back on mathematical ideas of complexity, like algorithmic complexity, or perhaps even complexity within the domain of physics. And we talk about things like Lyapunov's equation and the edge of chaos and things like that. The truth is that software is complicated. Software belongs in the complicated domain. It's an incredibly constrained thing. Everything we do as software engineers, from the design of a processor to the design of a compiler to the contracts we write in object-oriented code, is about restricting the behavior of the system. Software is incredibly constrained. And so what we actually do as software engineers and architects is that we take complicated systems, complicated software systems, and we put them into complex contexts. And so what happens when we put those complicated systems into complex contexts is that the complex context, which is this space out here, starts to stress our complicated system. Things start to happen in there that we can't predict, that we can't control. So things like the behavior of our competitors, the kind of rules and regulations our governments put on the business that we're doing, the behavior of our consumers, the behavior of markets, the economy, political things, pandemics tend to cause ruptures and stress in the business system. And that causes the business system to ask the complicated software system to do things that it hadn't previously asked it to do, which causes a great deal of stress inside the system. And what happens is if we build these systems with rigid architectures, then the system that we build as architects becomes a source of stress on the business system because it can't change quickly enough. And that can lead to delays in time to market. It can lead to disappointed customers. It can lead to employee and customer churn, and it can cause the death of your business. And just ask Blockbuster whether or not that's actually a possibility. So as architects, then, our job is to design the structure of these complicated systems. And that leaves us in the unfortunate position of enforcing structure in here, which can kill the system and have a devastating effect on the business's ability to cope within its own environment, which means we have to deliver structure despite the fact that we don't know what's going to happen in this complex context that our system has to live in, which is pretty depressing. So essentially what I'm saying is that our job is to predict a future which we can't predict, and that the probability of failure for our systems is very close to 1. So we have to do something that we can't do and we're almost guaranteed to fail. And that's a summary of what architecture is in this new complicated world, or this new complex world that we have to live in. And so we need to do something different. We can't just continue doing what we're doing in this kind of environment. And so what we do is we look to different ways of coping with complexity. How do we cope with this complexity outside of the software industry? Because after all, the universe that we live in, the universe that we inhabit as human beings is complex, okay? The relationships between cause and effect in our world are not entirely apparent, and they're not tight. The world that we live in is not tightly constrained. It's not a complicated system. We live in a complex system, and we manage to live fairly good and fairly happy lives in this complex system. So human beings inherently know how to handle complexity. So what ways are there to do this? Well, the first way to handle complexity is to simply ignore it and just live through it and hope for the best. And that's one strategy. Another way to deal with complexity is to outsource it, is to make the complexity someone else's problem, and we can just go on living our lives and don't have to deal with it. And we do that quite a lot. For example, with medicine, we outsource the complexity of our own bodies and our own health to the health service, to your doctor. Someone else takes care of it for you. As software engineers, we outsource complexity by asking for requirements. We go to the business and we say, tell us your requirements. What do you want me to build? And what we're saying when we say that is we want you to take away all the complexity and tell us the parameters for building the complicated system. In that case, whenever the complex business system changes or something becomes dynamic and our software fails to live up to that complex change, then we can blame it on the business people who told us the requirements and say, well, you never asked us to build this. In the age of complex responsive systems, that isn't going to be acceptable anymore. We aren't going to get away with this for much longer. We've gotten away with it for a very long time, blaming the complexity, blaming our inability to cope with complexity on the business, but they're starting to catch on and they're going to get more and more upset with us. Another way of dealing with complexity is to develop heuristic. And heuristic means that whenever we see a certain pattern occurring, we have a certain response to that pattern. An example in the IT industry is N-tier applications. So we've all gotten used to the idea since the mid-90s that an application should have a presentation layer, a business logic layer, and a data layer. And when these three layers, whenever we meet a problem, then we immediately go into the heuristic. We start thinking about the solution in terms of presentation, in terms of business logic layer, in terms of data layer. The same thing happens, for example, if you go for a walk in a park in Stockholm today and you hear a rustle in the bushes, your limbic system tightens and you immediately start to think, I mean, your body immediately prepares you to run because there's a rustling in the bushes. In most cases, the rustling in the bushes is caused by a squirrel. There's absolutely no need for you to run. But because of our inherited response to this, because once upon a time our ancestors lived in, who lived around this area, had to deal with bears and things in the bushes, we've learned this response. It's a heuristic response. And there haven't been bears in Stockholm for a very, very long time. And that's part of the problem with heuristics, is that when we develop a heuristic, it's very, very hard to get rid of. For example, I've seen IoT systems where you have millions and millions of connected devices built using the same heuristic from the 1990s, which is a business logic layer and a presentation layer and a database layer. And if you apply that kind of pattern to that kind of problem, it tends to fall down very, very quickly. Another way of meeting complexity is this goat here. And when our ancestors lived in tribes, when they lived in, before we had any concept of germ theory or bacteria or illness, if someone got sick, we didn't know what to do. And when we don't know what to do, if you think back to the Kinevin framework that we looked at, and we're under pressure and we're panicked, then we just do something. We do something random. We inspect the results of our random action. And if it helps, then we do it again. If it doesn't help, then we try something else. And so back when we lived in these villages and we had no concept of medicine or germ theory, if a child got sick, we just did whatever came into our heads, random actions. And so one day, somebody grabbed a goat and killed it. Just said, okay, let's try this. If we kill the goat, will it appease the gods? Will the child become better? And that's a very normal human reaction in a chaotic system. It's the same as just swerving when you meet a car on the road in that chaotic system that we talked about. So whenever the problem arises then, whenever we kill the goat and the child gets better, because we have no way of understanding the relationship between cause and effect in a complex system, we have a tendency to mistake correlation with causation. And so the next time a child got sick in the next village, you can be sure that the parents of that child would kill a goat because they'd seen this result before. And we do the same thing in our industry. We see that if you walk into a room, you'll see walls covered in post-it notes. You'll see people standing up in meetings. You'll see people mapping processes and putting them in databases that no one ever listens to, no one ever reads again. Those things are goat's blood. And we tend to indulge in superstition whenever we don't actually know what to do in a complex situation. So the way that we need to respond to complexity then is not superstition, it's not outsourcing, it's not ignoring the complexity and hoping it goes away, and it's definitely not importing our old heuristics that we've learned to do in old systems. What we need to do in order to cope with complexity is to develop new heuristics. And because we work in an industry where things change so quickly, we need to get good at developing heuristics and letting them go very, very quickly, which means that we need to go into every project, every engagement that we do as architects as blank slates, rather than bringing in historical things and trying to make it work. So how do we do that? So if you look through the literature on software engineering, you'll find that there's very, very little on how to cope with uncertainty and how to cope with complexity. And the material that does exist on these subjects tends to talk again about algorithmic complexity and trying to find mathematical approaches to solve these problems. Those approaches do not work as yet. So then we come to this book by a guy called Nassim Taleb. It's a book called Antifragile. And this book is very interesting to us as software architects, because here in this book, this guy Taleb talks about systems that are able to cope with stress that they cannot see. Systems that are able to survive stress that they weren't designed to survive. And that's very, very interesting to us as software architects, because that's exactly the solution that we're looking for to this problem of having to work in complex environments which we cannot predict, where failure is almost guaranteed. And so Taleb talks about systems that are anti-fragile, systems that become stronger as we apply stress to them. And the classic example of this is Europe during the Black Death, during the plague in the 13th century. And what happened was Europe was exposed to a form of stress that it hadn't been designed to survive. And that form of stress was the Black Plague. We'd never seen it before. We hadn't designed our society to cope with this kind of thing. And there was no central committee or planning agency or enterprise architecture board that sat down and decided what our response to plague was going to be. What happened was that we survived anyway. We survived. There's more of us now than there was then. We're significantly better off than we were then, and very few of us are going to die from bubonic plague. So the society in Europe was able to cope with this problem, despite the fact that it wasn't specifically designed to do so. How is that even possible? Well, the truth is that there are 4 properties that our society had that helped us to survive a previously unknown stressor. The first is that we're modular. Human society is modular. It's modular at the level of the individual. So we're all separated by our skin. And that means if I get sick, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else in my tribe or my village gets sick. Certainly there is contagion, but if I die, then I die alone. Everyone doesn't die with me. We have a weak link to each other, and that weak link is through the air. We're not physically connected to most of the people around us, and we can choose, as we see right now, we can choose to increase or decrease that level of physical connection through distancing. We are also incredibly redundant. There are millions of us, and there were millions of us in 13th century Europe as well. So it's hard to kill all of us at once. And we're also diverse. Diverse in that across Europe in the 13th century, we lived in different places, we lived at different altitudes, we lived in different communities. Those communities had different beliefs, those communities had different ways of living their lives and different forms of agriculture and different social structures, which means that we had many, many different configurations which could resist plague when it came to us. And the combination of these 4 things helped us to survive plague in the 13th century, along with other things. For example, one of the things that helped us to survive plague was that small towns and larger towns were surrounded by walls, which meant it made it easy for these towns to keep strangers out, which stopped them spreading the plague within the town. Thing is that those walls weren't built to prevent plague from spreading. Those walls were built to prevent other towns and villages from attacking us. And so one particular form of stress, which was the constant warfare that existed in Europe in the 13th century, or the constant threat of outsiders, forced us to build defenses, which then turned out to be useful in surviving something which we hadn't predicted and didn't see coming. So Taleb's book is incredibly philosophical and not very useful to a software architect. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the book about why you shouldn't trust technology people, because they tend to make your systems fragile, which is exactly what we do as technology people, because we bring our complicated solutions into these complex environments and we actually make the system more likely to fail because of the way we think. So as an extension to Taleb's work, there's a researcher in Norway called Kjell Jørgen Holle who wrote a book called Antifragile ICT Systems. And Holle investigated a number of systems, one of them being Netflix at the time, and came to the conclusion that despite Taleb's chapter on why we are all such terrible people, us technologists, it is possible to build software systems that show these anti-fragile tendencies, and that those software systems share these 4 properties: modularity, weak links, redundancy, and diversity, share these 4 properties with other anti-fragile systems like 13th century European society, that makes them able to survive unknown sources of stress, which sounds fantastic. The problem with this is that it seems a little bit obvious, because we've known in the software industry for a very long time, since 1968, that some degree of modularity is necessary for our systems to be able to survive the environment that they live in. The problem we have as software architects today isn't that we're unaware of the need for modularity and loose coupling and redundancy and diversity. It's that we're unaware of how we make these decisions. And so our entire industry is based on a whole bunch of goat's blood and superstition about how we divide our solutions up into different types of modules. So we need to get better at that. Other things that are considered very important, and it's going to be very important for us, is the concept of stress. So I talked about how walled cities prevented the spread of plague, but those walls weren't initially built to help us avoid plague. They were built as a defense against other human beings. We wouldn't have built those walls without stress coming from another source. And so one of the things that Taleb observes is that any system that's anti-fragile, and they can be biological or political, social or economic systems, that shows anti-fragile properties, has been formed through stress. And that's a very, very important lesson for us as software engineers. And we'll see that in the next few slides. Another thing that's important is the concept of optionality. Stress actually causes us to create more options for the future, which makes it easier to survive unknown stresses. And convexity, which is the concept of sometimes a very, very small investment, no matter how pointless it seems, or how small it seems, can save us from ruin. An example is wearing masks in a pandemic, for example. So Taleb's position is that wearing a mask costs you almost nothing. And the potential, even if you don't know if it works or not, the potential return is that you get to continue being alive. So the cost of being wrong is very, very small. And he calls that convexity. And so what we do is we take these ideas, and the 4 properties of anti-fragile systems, and the concept that anti-fragility is born in stress, and we apply it to software architecture. How do we do that? Well, we take our naive architecture, which we build based on heuristic or superstition, doesn't matter. We take a naive architecture, which is the picture that appears in your head as an architect as soon as a business person tells you about their problem, and we start to add stress to it. And every time we add stress to the system, we figure out, how do I avoid this stress? And we add, and then we change the system. We change the structure of the system in order to be able to avoid this particular form of stress. And then we add another stressor and another stressor until the system starts to really change shape. Now, these stressors are really, really important. The first stressor that I get my students to use on their systems is, what happens if a competitor drops their price? Now, I remember we build these complicated systems inside these complex contexts, and the stress that hits our system comes from the context, not from the system itself. So it has to be stress that belongs in the context that we use. And so a competitor dropping their price isn't even a black swan. That's a particularly constant threat in any market. Your competitor drops their price. How does your architecture respond to that? The vast majority of architects can't answer that question. And this is something we need to get better at. When stress appears in the business environment, how does your architecture respond? If we build systems where we've ignored that kind of thing simply by asking for requirements and ignoring the wider context, then we're going to build systems that are very, very fragile to that kind of change in the environment. And so the first stressor then is to teach my students we need to think about the environment. The second stressor is that giant fire-breathing lizards come into your city and destroy the city in which your company is based. How does your architecture respond to that? And at this point, it might seem quite ridiculous, but the point of this stressor is this. Probability is not important, okay? Everyone thinks that that's a ridiculous stressor because the chances of fire-breathing lizards coming out of the Baltic and destroying Stockholm is very, very small. We've been trained by enterprise risk management and by thinking in terms of complicated systems, we've been trained to ignore things that have a very low probability. And that means that we dismiss them. The thing is that if I build a system and I change that system so that it's able to cope with these fire-breathing lizards, I've actually built a system that's able to cope with war, it's able to cope with flooding, it's able to cope with fire, it's able to cope with social unrest, it's able to cope with a pandemic. And so every time we adjust our system to cope with one form of stress, we're actually meeting lots and lots of different forms of stress. And so the idea of probability, the idea that something has to be probable or likely is something we have to get rid of because we are unable to distinguish between what is probable and what is not in these complex environments. Your idea of what's probable in an environment is about bias. It's about what you've seen before in your life. In fat-tailed power law distributions, that kind of thinking doesn't work. It only works in normal distributions, and that's absolutely not what we're working in. And so what happens then is that we add these stressors and the system begins to change shape until it's completely unrecognizable from the naive architecture that we would have proposed in the beginning. And what we do is with these stressors, we take our list of stressors and we divide it in two. And we use one half of the stressor list to do this process. And we use the second half of the stressor list to test our work. And so we come back here with our second set of stressors and we run them against our naive architecture. And we write down the number X that the naive architecture is able to survive. How many of these unknown stressors does our naive architecture survive? And then we run the same set of stressors against this, which is our residual or our anti-fragile architecture, and we write down the number Y. And generally, when I've done this, Y is always bigger than X. And so we've built a system that has a higher tendency, a greater tendency to survive unknown stressors than what we originally thought of. And there are mathematical reasons why this happens, and my research is based on proving that this is actually the case all the time. Anecdotally, Y will generally be bigger than X, which is empirical proof that I, as an architect, have built a system that's capable of surviving more stressors in that long fat tail out here that helps me to survive in a complex environment which I'm not in control of, which I can't predict. And so we've come some way towards solving the problem of how do I build a system to survive things which I won't be able to predict as an architect. And like I said, there's another layer to this where I'm working on proving these things out mathematically. Something called hypernetworks, which you can go to this kind of article which I've published in Procedia, which talks about the more mathematical structures behind this and how this is actually going to work. And so what I'm trying to do with all of this work and this research is I'm trying to produce a body of work that can act as a science upon which we can do architecture. Because architecture today is not built on science, it's built on superstition, it's built on goat's blood. And that's not a criticism of our industry, it's a reflection of how old our industry actually is. And so if you're a chemical engineer, you have a scientific backing, which is chemistry. Mechanical engineers have physics, programmers have computer science. Architects don't have anything. And so everything that I'm building today leads to a set of scientific theories called residuality theory, and residuality theory going forward will hopefully be the scientific basis upon which we can build the profession of architecture, rather than being a profession which is based on goat's blood, like medicine before the introduction of randomized trials. And so the way that we do this then, and we've already looked at this, is that we have this concept of a stressor analysis. And this is an example of a stressor analysis, which I've done for a company who was building a worldwide network of electric car chargers. And the really interesting thing with this stressor analysis is, firstly, we go through and we identify all the stressors that we possibly can. And if you look here, there's a couple of stressors that are really, really interesting. Stressor number 3 is a field login. When we fail to log in, the customer can't identify themselves. They have a little card that they blip when they drive up to the charging station. If that doesn't work, what do we do? Well, we don't want to leave someone sitting there with a car that can't go anywhere. So what we do is we add some technology, which is automatic license plate recognition. We allow the customer to charge their car, and then we look them up via their registration and send them a bill later on when they can't identify themselves. And so that's an example of, I've identified a stressor. Here's the augmentation I need to make to my system, which is ALPR. I integrate that with my system, and now we don't suffer from this stressor anymore. The next stressor that we look at is damage. So someone might accidentally drive into a charger, or they might come and smash one up, because that's the kind of thing that people do. And so the mitigation here is to add redundancy, have as many chargers as we possibly have, more chargers than we actually think we need, and to have security cameras in order to dissuade people from destroying things on purpose. Another stressor that this industry suffers from is that customers will occasionally abandon an electric car in a charging spot and go off and play around a golf. A fast charging station needs about 25 minutes to get a car to 80%. So there's absolutely no need for us to sit there for 8 hours, and that costs us money. It's frustrating for other customers. And so what we do is we take something from an earlier stressor, which is ALPR, and we add the ability to invoice per minute. And so you can see that these stressors are related to each other. They're not completely separate. If you do enterprise risk management, it tends to work with risks and stressors as if they're linear, as if they aren't related to each other. One of the problems with that kind of approach is that we don't see how interrelated these stressors are and how they impact the potential structure of a system. And so by starting with requirements, what we want the system to do, rather than how a system should behave in its environment, we miss this rich picture of what our system is actually going to be exposed to. So the good news here is that we have another stressor that appeared after we built the system. And this stressor is something called icing. And icing is something that's, for the minute, unique to North America. And what happens is someone in a diesel or petrol car will deliberately park their car in front of an electric car charging station in order to prevent people with Teslas from charging their cars. Why? Well, there's a whole load of social and political and psychological reasons why people indulge in this kind of behavior, but it's happening, and that's the only thing that matters. So that is something, that's one of these black swans. That's something that we could never, ever have predicted was going to happen. Okay. And what the interesting thing with this stressor is that if we combine the mitigations from number 12, which is to invoice per minute, number 3, which is ALPR, which allows us to invoice per minute, and our security cameras from stressor number 8, we've already solved the problem. And this is the same thing we've seen with the walls in medieval Europe. Stress caused them to build walls. Those walls turned out to help with a different stressor that the people who built the walls had no concept of, which was plague. And we see this pattern happening over and over again. That as we build a system to resist different kinds of stress, the relationships between these different kinds of stress, which we can't even mathematically appreciate or understand in a complex environment, allows us to survive stress that we've never seen before. And that's the principle upon which this entire philosophy is built. Once we've identified those stressors, once we've identified the structure that might help us resist that, and once we've empirically proven using our testing set and our training set of stressors that we've actually done something good, then we need to integrate the system together in a way that doesn't cause more problems than what we've created. And so we do this using something called contagion analysis. And contagion analysis is our way of making sure that we aren't doing any damage to the system. And it helps us to make decisions about what are the precise components that I need to use in order to build this system, in order to make sure that it doesn't crumble under the influence of unknowns, of stressors that we haven't been able to see. And so in 1972, there's a guy called David Parnas who wrote a paper called on decomposing a system into modules. And he recognized the problem that we had in our industry. And that problem was that if you present this process to a software engineer, so I have a process in the real world that looks like A, then B, then C, then D, and you ask that engineer to give you a breakdown of software components for that process, you will get this: component A, component B, component C, component D. The problem in this kind of architecture is that you create dependency between A and B and C and D, such that if there's a stressor that impacts one of these steps in the process and causes the process to change, that change is difficult to do in the software, because the software is welded to the process as it was. But it's even worse than that, because if you have a second process, which is D, E, F, G, those same engineers will give you D, E, F, G as your component breakdown. And because we've been taught at university and in our working lives to try and import some notion of mathematical elegance and the idea of reuse and libraries into our software, especially within object orientation, and then we tend to look at things like these two processes and say that A and D are very, very similar components, so we'll put them in the same, we'll group them in a single component. And that means that when a stressor acts on component B, it will also, that stress will impact E, which will impact A and D because of this dependency, which will impact C and F because of this dependency, which means the only piece of the system that's still working is D and G, and that's pointless because D and G is completely isolated and can't do anything now. And so the way that we think about decomposition in our software systems is actually very, very damaging and creates software systems that have a hard time responding to stress that they haven't been designed for. So our way of thinking, our way of breaking down problems, our way of analyzing things from this process-centric view of the enterprise actually causes our architectures to limit the ability of our businesses to respond to complex changes. And so what we actually have to do is to move from this rigid process understanding of a business, and there are a lot of details, a lot of history about why we view businesses in that way, to something called an actor network, where we have this collection of software components and people and organizations that interact with each other in order to reach a particular goal. So the person here wants this person here to do something, and that something is achieved through these interactions, through this path. But what happens is that a new person can pop up here, for example, which brings a change to the process, and there are new interactions which we hadn't seen before, which changes things very, very quickly. This is how reality actually works, but we're stuck in this rigid process-centric UML use case way of seeing the world, which prevents us from being able to react to the kind of changes that this guy brings to the network. And if we're stuck mapping our software to this brittle, overstructured way of describing the world, then we're constantly importing that pattern. So the way to avoid this is to do something called flow-based decomposition, which is a number of heuristics that we use in order to define our software systems. And it involves describing our systems rather than describing them in terms of process. We describe them in terms of flow, and flow is about these interactions here between agents in our systems. And we bring a number of new heuristics into how do we design these systems. We keep our flows very, very separate. We use queues to separate components from each other so that there are no direct calls. We separate databases from process execution. And we have very strict rules about how these flows can communicate with each other. For example, they can only communicate via queue, they can only communicate one way, things like that. And this allows us to arrive using our picture of stress. We can go through these kind of architectures and ask ourselves, are these components really necessary? And using this process of flow-based decomposition, we can very, very quickly arrive at conclusions about should this be a monolithic system like this, or should it be a microservice system with a lot of queues and loosely coupled components? And we do that by following this heuristic, adding as many queues and decoupling points as possible, and then using our picture of stress, which we've built up on our stressor analysis, to decide what's really necessary. And this way, we assume that all systems are complex, but we also give ourselves the opportunity to back out of that and to deliver something very, very simple, such as this monolithic design, which may be entirely appropriate. Which means that we don't have to spend time identifying, are we in a complex environment? Are we in a complicated environment? Is this an obvious problem? We simply follow these heuristics. We follow the modeling of stress, and we get an answer out of this process. And so once we've done that and we've identified our components, we can do a little bit of very, very simple mathematics with a number of matrices. And these matrices are tools that are used within the aerospace industry to identify dependency between components, as well as something called incidence matrices, in order to allow us to make decisions about which functions should exist inside a component boundary, which components should exist inside a process boundary, how do we separate these components, and we do that based on the picture of stress that we've built up through our stressor analysis. And so without actually asking our business for requirements, we're getting to an architecture, we're getting to a set of decisions about which components are going to exist, what the structure is going to look like. We also have a paper trail. We have a very, very concrete idea of why did we arrive at these decisions, which isn't present in most modern day architectures. If you ask most developers or architects, why do these components look like this? Why is this function in this component? The answer that you get, usually, if they're honest, is that it's based on gut feeling. And that goes back to what Parnas identified in this ABCD. It's a gut feeling that we learn at university and through our careers, and we're not really good at articulating it. And so these methods, these methodologies give us a way of creating a paper trail, saying we made these decisions because we've seen these numbers in these matrices. After that, once we've got to this point, now we've used these techniques to help us navigate uncertainty. The fact is that we are incredibly uncertain about what happens in these environments. We're incredibly uncertain about what kind of stress exists in these complex environments that surround the complicated systems that we have to build. After this, we need to do some form of architectural trade-off. We need to make sure that the picture we have of the business actually lines up with what our business stakeholders see, and we use something called ATAM, the Architecture Trade-Off Analysis Method, a slimmed-down version of that, in order to verify what we've learned from our stressor analysis and from our contagion analysis. And the final step in anti-fragile systems design is something called failure mode effects analysis. And now we've stepped over from the world of complexity science into the world of systems engineering. And failure mode effects analysis is a thing where we isolate each component inside our flows, because we've decided to describe our architecture in terms of flow. So this is quite easy. And we ask ourselves, what are the ways that this component can fail? What impact does that have on the system? How do we detect this failure? And what kind of mitigation can we have? And so what happens as we move through this process is that we start to understand the kind of technical failures that can happen inside our system, that can bleed back out into the environment around our system and cause problems in the business. And this is the kind of standard systems engineering that we should be doing that helps us to cover that part in the middle of the bell curve. And this kind of approach is absolutely vital for anyone who wants to build systems in modern cloud platforms. And so what happens is, we get this thing called nonlinear system responsiveness, and we've already seen an example of that. So when we solve for one stressor, we often solve for many, many stressors, just like these lizards solve for a whole bunch of different things that can happen in our society. And as we move through this and through the FMEA analysis, where we're looking at the internal stress that's caused by the interaction of components, we build a system to survive a number of stressors, X number of stressors, and it turns out that that system will actually survive Y number of stressors, and Y can be orders of magnitude bigger than X. And that's what we call nonlinear system responsiveness. And what we'll have done then is we will have built a system that is more likely to survive unknown stressors, which is the challenge, as I said at the start, the challenge facing us as architects today. This requires an entirely new kind of architect. Okay, so it's not enough to just pick your favorite framework and execute on that framework. It's not enough to simply diagram and map things in processes. The job of the architect becomes one of navigating uncertainty, of working not with what we know, like a framework or a mapping tool or a set of heuristics for decomposition, but it's about working with what we don't know in order to build something that will survive in a world that we don't actually understand. And this requires that we actually are with the business in terms of we're building something to bring about a business goal, not just delivering an IT service. It requires that we understand the business and the context and the market. Otherwise, we have no chance of identifying these stressors. It also requires that we have technical expertise, because you can't execute on a FMEA if you don't understand the components that you're working with. And so the combination of these techniques, there's flow-based decomposition, stressor analysis, along with ATAM and FMEA. These four things are the four central pillars of anti-fragile systems design. And they actually feed off each other, and they feed back into each other in a way that every iteration, every time you look at the system, every time you analyze stress, every time you add new stressors, discover new stressors, the system becomes stronger over time, eventually leading to that situation where you see that the system starts to withstand stress that it wasn't designed to withstand. So if you're interested in getting more information about this process, and obviously there's a lot more going on here than we can cover in 90 minutes, you can find these papers, which have been published on Procedia Computer Science, which talk about the anti-fragile design process and the anti-fragile. When we talk about it in scientific terms, we call it residuality theory. And there's been a number of papers published on this. There's a 4-day course on the 8th to the 11th of February, where we'll go through these things in detail, and you'll get a chance on that course to bring your own architecture to the course and refine that architecture through using these techniques, and see how these techniques actually deliver these results in real time, in real life, as we work through the ideas and the architecture and the philosophy behind this, with the idea that you'll leave this course as an architect who's able to think critically about the uncertainty in their projects, and able to deliver systems that can survive unknown stressors through concrete decision making, despite the fact that we work in highly uncertain environments. If you're interested in this stuff, then I've made a commitment to all my previous students to do my literature review for my PhD out loud. So on my LinkedIn feed, you'll see a constant feed of articles and books and ideas that I'm reading and that I'm putting together in order to provide the mathematical and philosophical background for to give these ideas a little bit more rigor and a little bit more credibility, because if we're going to build a scientific base for architecture, then it has to be scientifically credible. So follow me on LinkedIn. You have my email address here. Any and all questions are welcome. And with that, we have 6 minutes left for questions. If any, were there any questions in the chat, Matt? Max?
No questions from the chat so far.
Okay, so that was a high-speed introduction to anti-fragile systems design. There's a lot more to it. So we have one question that's come up here. So the difference between risk management and thinking like this. So the major difference between risk management is firstly that in the vast majority of enterprises, we collect requirements, we design a system, and then we do risk management. And that's even the way that it's done in something like ATAM. And the major difference between what I do and what you do in enterprise risk management is, firstly, we have absolutely no probability. When we're dealing with stressors, we don't talk about probability whatsoever. That means that lizards are taken just as seriously as disk failure, even though the probability of disk failure is many, many, many times higher than giant fire-breathing lizards coming out of the Baltic. They're still taken care of. So the idea is that we don't think about this impact times probability, which you do in enterprise risk management, isn't there at all. We're not actually managing risk. We're doing design. And instead of looking to classical requirements engineering things, what we're doing is we're investigating the narrative in an enterprise, the stories that people tell, the things that they're afraid of, what their anxiety leads them to talk about. We're investigating that narrative in order to capture as good a picture as we can of the complex environment that our software system is going to live in. Then we make design decisions. Once we have that design, we use tools like ATAM, and we indulge in classical risk management afterwards, because there are still issues of due diligence that have to be done, and we have to show that we've considered certain types of risks and can mitigate them. So risk management and anti-fragile systems design are quite separate from each other, because we're not managing risk, we're doing design. And that's why we can get rid of probability and get rid of impact. And what we're doing is we're enabling ourselves as architects to engage with the uncertainty in an environment. So I hope that answers your question, Jürgen. There's a whole article on the differences between anti-fragile or residuality theory and enterprise risk management, which I'll send out when we send the slides out to everyone. I'll see that you get it. It was published in the United States last summer. Another question we have is, are there any standard stressors to begin with? Yes, there's what happens if a competitor drops their price? What happens if giant fire-breathing lizards come out of the sea? Then we tend to use something called business model canvas to generate another bunch of stressors around the relationships that you have, your supply chains, your key assets, your customer relationships, and your costs. And then we use tools like PESTLE to talk about the political and economic and legal environment that you work in, which helps us to generate stressors. What I tend to stay away from is any concept of standard, because one of the key lessons of anti-fragile systems design is that you have to approach every project as a blank slate. And one of the huge problems that we have in enterprise architecture or in architecture in general is, and I've seen this at large organizations, non-functional requirements become a checklist. And everyone goes through the checklist and says, yes, we've done this for maintainability, and yes, we've done this for scalability, whenever these things are entirely related to the unique individual stress that surrounds every project. And if we go to the concept of standard stressors, then we just end up with checklists and Excel sheets that we put ticks in, rather than spending time as architects investigating what is in this environment, what is there, what kind of stressors could possibly exist, what keeps people up at night. So yeah, there is a standard list of stressors that will get you started, but it's important to navigate this every single time. This is about architects moving away from certainty and being able to deal with uncertainty. And our instinctive reflex is always to find something that's certain, something that's definitely going to be right all the time. One of the things that we learned during the 4 days on the course is how to accept living in a world as a technical expert, which we all are, but being consistently wrong all the time, because that's what our job is going to involve in the future. It's not about being right. It's not about having a standard. It's not about having a guaranteed way of being right. We are always going to be wrong about everything we do, and we build systems that will eventually fail. And so a lot of this work is about accepting that's the way the world is. And once we accept that, it becomes much, much easier to build systems of great quality, because we don't have to lie to ourselves about standards and frameworks and things that always work. Hope that answers your question. Yeah, so there is a course on the 18th of October as well. And we also do internal courses if you want to have this specifically tailored towards your organization, or a shorter version of the course specifically tailored towards a specific project which you consider to be high risk or to have high levels of uncertainty. Then we can do that as well. All of that's through DFCOA. And for the internal courses, for the shorter versions tied to a project, they can also be delivered in Swedish as well, if necessary. Any other questions? Okay. In that case, thank you everyone for giving up your lunch hour to listen to this. I'm sorry about the technical problems, which I'm going to firmly blame on Telia. As I said, you have my email address there in front of you. Any and all questions. If you want more access to more of this content, more of this information, there's a lot of stuff flies past on my LinkedIn feed. Hi, Per, by the way, old colleague. And thank you for taking the time today, and hopefully we'll see each other in the future.